It's louder than, oh, yeah, this is louder. So hi, I'm Alesh. I'm with Cube Sensors. We built this. This is a small, beautiful cube, which is much larger here in the picture, that actually measures everything about the indoors. The cube is filled with sensors that measure like temperature, light, noise, humidity, barometric pressure, air quality, and so forth. And measures everything about that influences a human being, whether in your bedroom, in your office, or whatever. But the reason why I'm here is because we've built all this in Slovenia. We are shipping it worldwide for about now a year, and we seems to be what somebody would classify as a successful hardware startup. And the reason why I'm talking here is because the organizer asked me to talk about what actually the business of hardware startup means. And it turns out that it's significantly different than being a software startup, and what, at least in my experience, a lot of investors simply forget. So what I want to do today is to walk you through a few details or a few steps about what actually means building a hardware startup, what people who have actually experience with software often forget, and what primarily investors seem to ignore, which as an entrepreneur you simply shouldn't. So let's first look at just a brief description of how actually a software startup runs their business. As you can see, there are a bunch of, here is the number of software startups, there are a bunch of them working on ideas and sketching. Some of them come to minimal viable product, and some of them actually launch. And then they start iterating, scaling, and so forth. The big difference between hardware and software is that actually a proper software startup can launch an MVP, so minimal viable product, within like 2 months. That's actually not that difficult. In hardware, unfortunately, that period extends to, this doesn't work, okay. That period extends to almost a year. So when you start sketching and building an idea, then you start building a prototype. When you have a prototype, quite often hardware startups tend to go to crowdfunding campaigns, whether this is Indiegogo, Kickstarter, or whatever. But only then is when the fund starts. Quite often, hardware startups seems to believe that they are very successful if they had a successful crowdfunding campaign. It turns out that it's not actually the case. The real challenge starts when you start working on the production, when you start working on the manufacturing, the licensing, and all that. And actually, that takes roughly a year. That's why when I see a Kickstarter campaign that somebody was going to ship within like 4 months, well, I just tend not to believe it, because I saw how much problems that actually causes. There is a significant difference between building a prototype and actually manufacturing on a mass scale. On this slide, what I want to show you is that all the great things are actually stuff that a software startup has to do. If you're a startup, you have to do all these things. You have to do user support, you have to do marketing, you have to do backend, usability, whatever. You have to invest in that. But when you are a hardware startup, you have to put on top of that the engineering, the manufacturing, the firmware engineering, particularly if you're doing kind of smart devices, design engineering, which is a significant issue. For example, with Cube Sensors, we've managed to, with smart design engineering, we've managed to reduce the cost of our tooling by roughly 80% as opposed to our original plans, simply by having an indoor design engineering, figuring out what we should actually do. There is a huge area of safety and compliance, which obviously you don't have with software. If you build a mobile app, nobody will ask you whether this is certified, whether this you can ship actually to US, to Ukraine, to Korea. When you're doing a device, a lot of people is going to ask you that. Even more importantly, it's actually good for you to do it, but that costs money, and you have to go through certain procedures, and it takes time. In our case, for example, we have a power supply which was supposed to be certified, but when we put it through our own certification process, it turns out that it wasn't, and it could actually explode if we ship it to our customers, which was kind of problematic. And that added another 2 months to our schedule. That's why hardware is a bit different. But one of the fun things when I talk to investors is that whenever I talk to investors about a hardware startup, they tend to compare us to a software one. I even had an investor who says, we are only investing in companies that have at least 1 million users. I was okay, fine, but we actually ship stuff that people pay for. But he goes, no, that's the same thing. No, well, it's not. The idea here of this slide is just to show you that on the left-hand side, from your view, there is a, let's say, a freeware or a shareware software or an app that has roughly 1 million users after a year or a year and a half. It has roughly 4% conversion rate, and from those who actually convert, they pay $10 a year of some kind of subscription. Sorry. If you are a software developer, if you have somebody, if you have an app that has 1 million users, you're usually quite happy with that, right? But if you run the numbers of the averages and all that, it turns out that that app brings you roughly 400,000 K a year. On the other hand, you have a company that builds a device that sells it for $100, which is not unusual. It sells in the whole year roughly 12,000 units. This is actually some actual examples. Let's say that in the first quarter they have a Kickstarter campaign, and then that thing dropped off and slowly starting up. So they altogether they sold 12,000 units at 100K. They have to deal with margin, obviously, because they have to buy goods, then to sell them further. But at the end of the day, the business result is the same. They generated 400K. When I showed this slide to that same investor, his response was that I did something wrong in my calculations. Well, no, I didn't. So whenever you are working with hardware, just be aware that the scales and numbers are different. And when you are trying to get to the customer, every single sales counts. When you sell one cube or one device of yours, that's equal to getting 1,000 users who just try your app. Just remember that. There is another issue when building a hardware product, is that it's significantly different when you start positioning into what you're going to invest your development. Basically, there are three major markets. There is a consumer market, business market, and there is a tech market. So things like you do for other developers that they embed in their own systems. It turns out that majority of the hardware startups, at least the ones that come to me for an advice, tend to mix the two. And that's very crucial. Namely, if you are targeting consumer market, design and usability is extremely important. On the other hand, I would never go and design this kind of a device with all the fine details if I would want to sell it to an enterprise, because at the enterprise, it still has to look good, but it does not have to have all the finishes and polishes. It needs to have the durability, the maintenance abilities, return of investment characteristics that's good for a kind of enterprise buy. Similar goes to the tech. There are a bunch of startups who want to go and do a product for end consumers, filling it with the state-of-the-art technology, bleeding-edge technology that actually breaks from time to time. That kind of investment would make worthwhile if you are building something that other techies would use, like Raspberry Pi. You want to have it cutting-edge technology at that point that can be used really well, but you actually don't need to be really well designed and so forth. So whatever you go with the hardware startup, just focus on the one market. If you're doing on two, well, half of your investment is basically wasted, because there is no way that you're able to address the 2 or even 3 markets at the same time. Then there is always the fun of economics. This is something that looks like when you are in a software startup. In software startup, you invest roughly 60–70% of your money in salaries, in development, in the fact that you actually have to code stuff right? Then roughly 10% goes into logistics. By logistics, I mean you have to get the servers, or you rent Amazon servers or whatever. And then you have like some kind of margin in order to distribute your product. Let's assume that it's an app. In that case, 30% goes to Apple or Google or whatever. Unfortunately, when you're working with hardware, that logistics that slide or that division of costs changes significantly. You still have your R&D, you still have your logistics, which actually in our case becomes a proper logistics. So when I send a cube to a customer, they actually have to go through UPS or something through customs to the other part of the world. Then you have, of course, some kind of margin, which hopefully in the hardware world, it's at least 30% if you sell direct, or if you want to go to the stores and shops, it gets way more complicated. We can talk about that later if somebody is interested. But there is another thing that is there in the middle, which is BOM. That means bill of material. This is actually stuff that you have to buy in order to produce your device. The sensors and chips and plastics here cost me some money that I have to put in before I can actually build the stuff and ship it further. And that actually works only until I sell direct, which we do right now. So if somebody goes to cubesensors.com, you order it directly from us, somebody in my company packages for you and send it your way. However, if I want to be in a store, like most of us, majority of the devices we actually buy in stores, you have to go through retailers or wholesalers. Unfortunately, when you work with devices, every degree of separation from your customers takes away 25 to 30% of your margin. So the next time when you are squeezing a hardware startup, if they give you a discount or whatever they do, think about it, what they have to go through before they actually build a product to give it to you. If they sell it directly to you, it's highly likely that they work with 30% margin or even less. If you want to have 10% discount, that's 1/3 of their margin or even more, right? On the other hand, if you are buying stuff like whatever this is, from if you go to a local store, it's highly likely that roughly 30% of margin on this gets into that store's hands. The 30% on top of that gets into the distributor's hands who delivered it to the store, and that roughly 30% of that price is left at the manufacturers, where they have to carry all the warranties, the bill of materials, the assembly cost, and their own margin. So that's a big challenge with hardware, particularly with hardware startups. So whatever you do, when you calculate your margin, make sure that you figure out how all the distribution and costs and the delays fall into your place before you go with actually setting the price, which of course it cannot be too high. Then, of course, when you go with hardware, this is actually these are the numbers. These are 12 columns. These are cost assessment of a startup over a year. The bottom dark bluish columns are actually costs without hardware cost, or cost of the hardware without hardware cost. So if I would run a software company, right, those costs would be my costs. Basically, every month I do something more, I hire a bit more of engineers or whatever, so the cost structure rises slowly. Hopefully, my sales projections, my sales actually grows higher, and I'm making my living. When I'm in hardware, these are actually the ratios that happen, particularly in the hardware world like I'm in. Every 2 to 3 months, you have some major costs because you simply have to buy the next batch of your product. This is significantly capital intensive. And because we are only because I'm in a startup, banks don't really like us because we don't have like 5 years of balance sheet, we don't have like a long economic history, and we certainly don't want to put our houses on mortgage because we did already to actually have a startup. So the capital intensity of that is significant, and that's why actually pre-orders look great in order to deliver that first product, and even in that case, majority are simply not successful because there is a significant capital intensity. But all that hides away when you look at the bright side, right? So where are the advantages of the hardware startup? If you look at the biggest 4 exits, technical exits of this year, 3 of them are hardware. The biggest one was WhatsApp to Facebook, which is obviously not a hardware. But then you have Beats, then you have Nest, and you have Oculus Rift. These are all 3 hardware startups. I believe they're all younger than 5 years, and these were the 3 biggest exits of the year. Then there is another interesting thing about hardware, which is customer loyalty. If you just think of it, how often do you change your PC? When you have your PC at home, right, or in office, you change this every 2 or even more realistically, every 3 years. If you have your phone, you often change it every 2, maybe even 1 year, right? If you subscribe to a service, you renew it once a year, and then where something else comes in, it has to be really good service to renew it again. But if you're using just an app on the phone, it's quite often that the loyalty of the customers is 3 months or less. On the other hand, if you buy a device, unless it breaks, or if you buy a watch or a personal activity monitor, unless it breaks, the cost of switching to a competitor is way higher for me as a consumer, and it's great for me as a producer of the hardware, because once I sell you my device, I really need to mess up before you decide that you buy something else. So customer loyalty in that respect with hardware is great. Now, there is of course another thing that your competitors need to observe and really be careful about, and that are limited iterations. In software, you can easily iterate. When something's wrong, you just upload another code that's totally different from when I was an engineer, where they actually shipped the software on diskettes and disks and all that. Now you just upload it, and that's about it. If you are working on an app, you actually have to wait for a couple of days so that Apple approves it, but that's about it. In hardware, that simply doesn't work. If I ship you faulty hardware, 2 things happen. Number 1, I shipped you broken device, and you will demand that I replace it, which basically costs me a lot because I have to ship it to Ukraine or whatever and pay all those costs. But 2, even worse, as consumers, we are natively, our habits are that we compare devices to each other. So you really don't care whether I'm unfunded startup from Slovenia or whether you bought a new iPhone from Apple. Obviously, the capital difference is significant, but for you as a consumer, you simply demand that it works. But the good side is that your competitor needs to fulfill that same expectation. Working capital, I've already mentioned, which is a significant problem for your competitors while you are far ahead. But third, and the last point, which is significant problem again, is our production risks. I cannot tell you how many things went wrong with our production, and we literally sit on the factory. I cannot imagine how hardware startups can do that from the scratch somewhere in China while sitting in Ukraine or Italy or US, because things simply go wrong. And that's the advantage you have if you run a hardware startup against others. So that's it for me for now. I wrote a long piece about hardware startups, investing in startups. You can find it here, Harvard Guide, spetic.si. I still have 1 minute left, so if there are any questions, Go ahead. Yeah.
Did you participate some hardware accelerator?
Okay. Have we participated in any hardware accelerators? No, we did not. There's going to be a nice panel in about an hour on this stage about hardware accelerators. But basically, we did not participate in a hardware accelerator simply because when we started, which was 3 years ago, there was none. And by right now, I would like to say that I'm too smart for them, but that sounds wrong. Yeah. Anyone else? No. If that's the case, well, 10 seconds to spare. Thank you very much and enjoy your conference. Thank you.